Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Curitan. I'm Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. You're going to have the opportunity to hear about a really unique resource relating to teaching history in our classrooms and on a national stage. And I do want to note that today's program is part of our year-long focus on memory and memorialization. So we're delighted you're here. We want to invite you to follow us on social media and to check out all the events too that Revolution NJ is planning on at revnj.org. But to get us started and to introduce our speaker this afternoon, let me turn the program over to Rachel Timke, our Programs and Communications Manager at the Historical Commission. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. Personally, my own research has been in the history of education, so I am very excited for today's presentation. As just a quick housekeeping note before we get into it, if anyone is looking for professional development credit, I will be dropping my email into the chat. Please send me an email and we will send you that certificate. And with that, let me introduce our speaker for today. Christina Connor is the Assessment and Instruction Librarian at Ramapo College of New Jersey. She received both an MS in Information Studies and an MA in History from the University at Albany, and studied book history at Drew University. At Ramapo, she is the curator of the American History Textbook Project, a special collection within the library. She coordinates and teaches textbook-centered sessions and adults lessons and hands-on activities that use the collection. Her scholarship focuses on student engagement with special collections and is working towards digitizing the American History Textbook Project into a more robust digital archive. And with that, we will invite Christina Connor to the digital stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rachel and Sarah, for inviting me to talk to everybody today. I'm thrilled to see so many participants. As Rachel mentioned, my area is librarianship, but also the history of book history and looking at how textbooks were influential over time as an educational resource, as a historiographical resource, and in keeping with the theme that the New Jersey Historical Commission has been promoting, I wanted to look at the memorialization of New Jersey within these national resources and how we see and how the country sees New Jersey in the American Revolution. And so with that, I wasn't quite sure what the breakdown of participants was going to be. So I'm going to kind of showcase sections of the materials and talk. I can definitely am happy to speak, and we'll have some Q&A afterwards. But anybody who may find this collection interesting and want to know more about incorporating it in a classroom, or if you have classes that might be interested to come and visit the collection, we can definitely have that conversation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I will also mention that I am here with my puppy, and hopefully she will not disturb us too much as we go through this presentation. So, as we mentioned, the title of this presentation is Memorializing New Jersey on the National Stage, Teaching New Jersey's Past in the U.S. History Textbooks. And there is a link at the bottom. This is a link to a simple digital resource that complements our physical collection. I'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. And so the way that I want to structure this presentation is looking at New Jersey and the American Revolution. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, give some points on what historians have talked about New Jersey and its importance in the American Revolution, and moving into considering the legacy and their educational representation of that legacy within these materials. And then we'll have some time, I think, for a Q&A or discussion, or if anybody has any thoughts about what I present. So what I find interesting, looking at historians and how historians have looked at New Jersey within the American Revolution, they have a lot of positive things to say. What's interesting is that when I talk to students about when they think of New Jersey in the American Revolution, they might pinpoint, certain battles, certain key figures, but for the most part, and I had students who I work with actually help me in the development of some of the examples in this presentation, and they often commented that it's just soldiers coming in and out of New Jersey. That's all it is. It just seemed like a very simple narrative, and we'll talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the subtleties, but thinking in terms of how New Jersey has been thought about through historians. In the 40s, one historian called New Jersey the cockpit of the American Revolution, and was really the driving force within the American Revolution and where a lot of the action happened. Later on, considering that it was really this crossroads of opposing armies on a daily basis, and it was much more than just the Battle of Monmouth, the Battle of Trenton, and the Battle of Princeton. And that New Jersey and the military experience was a microcosm of the wider war. And this is a point that I'd like to asterisk, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. A very prominent historian, Gary Nash, really looked beyond the military and saw the vast contribution socially, economically, and intellectually that New Jersey played in the American Revolution, and it's geographic location between these two ports of New York and Philadelphia that made it a major player and a central player in 18th century Atlantic world. But like I said, I want to put a pin on that for right now, and we're kind of come back to that and some of these other ideas as we look through some examples. First, to get everybody oriented, if you're not familiar. So one of the areas that I like to teach students about and talk to students about is this value of historiography, which if you're a historian, you know that this is a really key part of our profession. And, I love this definition that talks about understanding that not everything is already known and agreed upon, that new historians have a place in the profession. So yes, there are hundreds and hundreds of books that have been written about the American Revolution, but you still have a place in writing in that narrative. And that really thinking about, the change over time. We have this thought that history is static and that it doesn't change. I think, we can see in various arguments that happen, they're changing history. Well, no, history is always evolving. What we know, how we contribute, what perspectives are included, this is not new. We've seen it throughout the profession. And so that's why it's so important to look at the value of historiography and those changing narratives and understanding that. And I think the best place to do that is within a textbook. I find a lot of times with students looking at larger narratives can sometimes be very overwhelming, but I've seen success with students really understanding how this idea of history and how we write about certain topics and events and people does change. And they understand that there are people behind who are writing these narratives, and they come to the table with different knowledge, different perspectives, different biases, and how these narratives are constructed. And it gets them thinking a little bit more about how certain topics are framed, how certain topics are looked at, and really what is given prominence and what isn't. So with textbooks, I find that it's really important and an easy way to introduce them to that topic. So I'm going to ask a silly question. You don't have to necessarily answer, but maybe answer in your mind. what is a textbook? And I think we all know, but I'll give you the Oxford English Dictionary version of what they say a textbook is, which is a book used as a standard work in the study of a particular subject. And it goes on to say that a book on a particular subject written specifically for students in formal education. There's an additional piece to this definition that I think is really important and I think helps us in this conversation, which is it is a work regarded as an authority in a given area. And so as we're going to see how these materials change, even subtly, it does sort of call into question that idea of, well, is it an authority? And how much of an authority? Are there other things that need to be included when looking at these materials and these different topics? So what I want to do is, in keeping with getting into the Revolution 250, we're going to look at New Jersey. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to also just expand where I talk about and where I look at New Jersey and other topics within the collection is a project that we have in at Ramapo College, where I am at, is the American History Textbook Project. This is a really fantastic and unique collection to the college and to a lot of other schools. Not everybody has materials like this or use them in the way that we do. This collection was actually founded by students along with two of our professors, and it was founded in 2009. It was shortly after I got to Ramapo, and we have materials published from 1820s. I think our earliest is 1825 now. That was just gifted to us by a former student, to the present. And when I say present, about 2015, 2016. And so these are materials that are of high school and elementary school level. They're for homeschool students. They're different religious schools would have used them, state-specific editions, also teacher editions, as well as some specialty editions. We do have some pamphlets that were included. They were published in the 1960s on the representation of African American history. And so those were published. One was published by Detroit, one was published by New York. And then we also have, and are starting to get materials that were intended for reservation schools. And so how American history would have been taught to students, Native students on reservation. And so it's a really interesting collection. We have somewhere between 300 and 350 materials, and we're always taking on new materials. Teachers will often donate, or students will find materials in their homes, and so they'll donate to us, which is great. Our largest donation was actually from the American Historical Association, which was fantastic. But the purpose is for researchers to explore how these topics have changed over time, and understanding that these are curricular resources, and sort of adding that extra dimension that these are not, and I try to explain to students, these are materials that are not intended for large consumption, in that they're intended for large consumption for students. And what are American history books? But they're really a way in which teachers can help students understand what it is to be an American, what it means to be being in this country and the history of this country. And so while the majority of our collection is centered in physical format, we do have a complementary guide that has some access to digital equivalents. So I say that because there used to be larger representation, but right now the guide really does point to materials that are archived on the Internet Archive. And I am working on trying to digitize the collection so we have control over it, because I'm finding that just as soon as I'm able to find a digital edition of something we have in our collection, it then goes offline or is no longer available. There was a data breach last year that actually took the collection offline for a couple of weeks, which was challenging for some of our student researchers. But we understand that not everybody can physically make it into the building. And so we do have something. And I'm happy to, if anybody has questions about what we're working on, I can definitely talk about that later. So on to the main purpose of the presentation, which is looking at New Jersey through within the American Revolution. So thinking of this, I see really three touch points for New Jersey. New Jersey as a revolutionary turning point, thinking mainly in Trenton and in Princeton, thinking about revolutionary players who are prominent figures that might be included in these materials. I'm sure we can all think of, or thinking of who I'm thinking of. And then also post-war and what influence they might have, New Jersey might have had in these materials, or what was being said within these materials. I want to also add that what I tried to do is I tried to pick materials that were representative of certain eras. I tried to pick materials that were representative of historians, as well as things that would have probably been widely used. When it comes to early books, so basically anything pre 20th century, it gets a little dicey. Is it a textbook? Is it something that would have been used as a history reader? Education was different during the 19th century as we know it now. But things that I think were generally used, well-known historians, at least as I know them. And so that's what I tried to do when I picked some of the samples that we're going to look at. So thinking about the battles within New Jersey, what's interesting and understandable is that earlier narratives, so within like the 1920s, and I would say up until the 1880s, these narratives, these books essentially covered colonization, the revolution, and the early years. So, there wasn't a lot going on. Within colonization, there could be chapters that were devoted to just New Jersey, as opposed to what we see now, which it might be one chapter that covers a wide array of histories. So, thinking about, in general, the American Revolution is numbered chapters. They don't use a lot of poetic language. It's just chapter 1 and then the information. And then sometimes there might be important themes under the chapters. The coverage is much more detailed. There's a lot more going into battle tactics used by Washington and how you really see the detail that's provided. You can understand why students would understand that these were important battles. And so that's interesting. But what's even more interesting is that this doesn't last for a very long time. And once we get past the Civil War and we start infusing that into these books, New Jersey starts being reduced to maybe a few paragraphs and later sentences when it talks about New Jersey within the Revolution. So jumping ahead a little bit and looking at the 1919 or 1920s, that progressive era of history, we start to see the chapters actually being thematically framed. And so we get the American Revolution and the sections that are devoted to New Jersey within battles. We're looking at the retreat through New Jersey, followed by American successes at Trenton and Princeton. And what I love about it is that the language starts to get a little bit more patriotic, enthusiastic. We start using more colorful language. A bold stroke revived American hopes. Striking successes gave patriots confidence. And so we have this really powerful language that shows the importance of these battles affiliated with Trenton and Princeton. But what's interesting, it gets even more, if you thought that was enthusiastic, it gets even more colorful when we start getting into the 50s and start looking at the War for Independence. And I love this, a brilliant victory in a dark hour. And so this is the section, this is how they're framing the section on New Jersey. and the war, what was going on in New Jersey, and how important, elevating the importance of New Jersey. What I love too is that these victories restored American courage and greatly strengthened the country's faith in Washington, which is interesting because anybody's been watching the Ken Burns documentary, they point out that there was a lot of tension that was still going on during these years of, were we looking to be a country, or were we looking to be left alone, and sort of those tensions within. And so we're already starting to frame within these materials that it's American courage and that we're already a country, which of course is understandable. We're in the 1950s. We're a world power at this point. We also I love looking at titles of textbooks. And so this is also where we start seeing materials within the textbook collection. We have probably 150 19th century books that say American history as the title. And once we start getting into the 40s, 50s, and so on, that's when the titles become much more colorful. We get the American story, or we get From Wilderness to World Power. They become much more patriotic. And so we also see that reflected within the language about topics, particularly around independence, and where we really see that New Jersey is elevated to this high pillar, in that this is important for us to look at, and we want to make sure that students are aware of it. When then we get into the 60s, and we revert a little bit. And so we start to see that instead of this being the glimmer of hope, Washington now gains minor victory in New Jersey. Battles are in passing. We are, framed as important, not necessarily significant, and it's more detached in language. And so I couldn't even find an adequate example to show the language. The title of the section is really the best, because it was one or two sentences that the battles happened, and then Washington spends Christmas in Morristown. So there wasn't even something significant that I wanted to share as far as sort of showcasing the language, because that's how minimal they made it. So within the span of a decade, we see it going from this high point to this something that is sort of mentioned in passing, and how we're, from national perspective, we're kind of moving past New Jersey. But it's okay, because when we get to the 70s, now we start to see that colorful language start coming back. We see American spirits being revived, and the reason to believe that they could actually win battles against the British. So again, looking at Trenton and Princeton being a pivotal moment in New Jersey's history within the Revolution. And, even so far as to, again, sort of titling the sections that they're talking about with New Jersey and New Jersey victories. So drawing the reader's attention to these areas and making sure that they're aware it's not just part of a larger narrative, but we really want to stress the importance of these battles. And if, we just see the rocking go up and down, and by the time we get then to the 80s, now we start pivoting more towards Washington. The idea of New Jersey is lessened. Instead of things being bringing to your attention New Jersey and how important New Jersey is, we now start to label it more about war in the middle colonies, where New Jersey is just one of many battles. I mentioned here that it's reduced to about 11 sentences, whereas before we might have gotten a couple of paragraphs. As I mentioned, even earlier books where we might have gotten pages. Now we're really starting to distill down into these smaller bits that are just kind of peppered in here and there for students to read. Now I want to come to one, and you'll see the asterisk, and we'll bring it back to what I mentioned before. So this is coming from the American People from 1998, and then the sections on New Jersey looking at the war for American independence and the war in the North. What's interesting about this, And you can see it's basically two sentences. For the next 2 years, the war swept back and forth across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. At Trenton in December 1776, and again at Princeton the following month, Washington surprised the British and scored victories that prevented the Americans' collapse. So these basically the two sentences that are used to describe this role that New Jersey had in military battles within the Revolution. This book was actually, the primary author was Gary Nash, who I mentioned earlier when we started about what were historians thinking when, in looking at New Jersey as a major player in the American Revolution. And, I was talking to some students and I asked them, and this is something that I find really interesting when we think of geography and certain themes, what do we think of? And one of those ideas I asked them, I said, when you think of liberty or you think of independence, what do you think? And, immediately, one said New York because they thought of the Statue of Liberty. And then the other one said Philadelphia. And somebody else said Boston. And so those are the places where we think about the revolution. But, we have examples of historians saying, no, like New Jersey was a major contributor and it was important. But by the 90s and almost 2000s, their role is reduced to a couple sentences and these battles. And so I find it fascinating in thinking about, like who made those decisions that New Jersey gets reduced while maybe other sections become more prominent, or why do we continue to have certain areas gaining more prominence than some others? So, things to get students and other researchers to think about, the perspectives that are presented in these large-scale materials. So I'll give you the last example that I have in relationship to this idea of the battles, and this is one of our more recent books from 2005. So we do bring back the battle. We get a little bit more space that is devoted to it. Battle of Trenton is definitely more emphasized, and we have, at least with a paragraph, as opposed to maybe some of the other areas which are peppered in. But I did find what was interesting is that this is one of the first times that we start seeing New Jersey and in particular Trenton being used as a important person or important name or term to remember and to write sentences. And so within the review of the chapter, the author is making sure, the historian is making sure that this is a place where we want students to remember and we want students to think about. I will point out what's interesting about this particular book, The Americans, it is one of the books that we have that there are a lot of different editions of it and state editions. And so I actually have access to about 5 different state editions of this, and they all continue to list Trenton. So it's interesting. It's not just the New Jersey edition. It is also the Illinois, the Kentucky, the Texas. So that is one of the ones that the editors believed, we want to, keep this across. And so, it is interesting. And again, thinking about, okay, what do we consider New Jersey on a national scale? What we want people to remember and continue to understand its importance. And this was one area that they emphasized, which I thought was interesting. So now I want to kind of shift a little bit and think about revolutionary players and, those figures that we might see connected to New Jersey. And sure, we're all thinking about it, particularly if you're from central New Jersey, as I am, and that would be in particular Molly Pitcher. And so we start to see, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, that women, as well as African Americans, Native American participation, civilian, even loyalist perspectives start emerging in these materials. And we start to see these sections that pop up about women in the revolution, as in addition to African Americans' participation, and other groups. And in particular, though, women seem to have some major prominence, and where New Jersey can enter back into the story is with Molly Pitcher. And so, here are just a couple of examples. What's interesting is that in the 1960 edition of West Story of Our Country, she's not mentioned within the general narrative, but she's actually given a picture in the section, Many People Bring Victory to the Revolution. And so, again, that editorial choice of, we're not going to include any information, but we will make sure that there is a caption and there's an image of her within the books. We think it's important enough to put it in. In The Rise of the American Nation, we see that now we're included, or she's included in the narrative, but isn't connected to New Jersey, but yet they have Deborah Sampson, who, if you have read a little bit, some also attribute her to being maybe Molly Pitcher, but there's no visual. And again, a section on women in the Revolution. Finally, we get in A History of the United States, listed, credited in New Jersey, considered more famous than others, and slightly more detail, particularly her name being given. And I put that in quotes because what's interesting is that our understanding of who she was, many different names get used. And so I think for this one, they credit Molly Macaulay or Mary Macaulay for this particular book. Another book is looking at Mary Ligwood Hayes. Others have accredited her with Margaret Corbin. So even when we think, okay, we're understanding that, is this and which we understand, like, is Molly Pitcher a composite of many women? Was there a real, even when we're trying to explain, like, Molly Pitcher wasn't her name, we're still not understanding. And in these books. And just to give you some images, so we've got coming from the West Story. So this is the example that she's pictured, but she isn't actually mentioned in the grander narrative. The Revolutionary Heroes is a caption just for the pictures, not necessarily as part of the larger discussion. What I also find interesting that is in 2005, there's a slight alteration to the text because we move from women in the revolution or sections that are devoted to different groups to civilians at war. And so, again, we get a picture and the editorial choice of making sure that there is an image associated with the narrative, in addition to the section about made her a non-commissioned officer. So there's a little bit more, but I do find it interesting that we go from talking about women in the revolution and different groups to we're just going to put them all together and we're just going to call them civilians at war. And so here, this is from the American. So we see the heroine of the Battle of Monmouth, the famous painting that goes with that. And so, again, what are they including visually as well as textually with these materials? So lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the creation of the country and sort of the ebbs and flows of what we see as far as New Jersey's role in the post-war period. And so looking at, in particular, the New Jersey Plan, we can see that it's one of those places where in some cases it's not mentioned. So in A History of the United States, as well as Our Country, there's no mention of it. Bringing Back West Story of Our Country, it's in there, but Patterson is not credited. But what's interesting is that we do credit Madison with the Virginia Plan. And a lot of the books, either in the early editions, will capture it as the New Jersey plan or the New Jersey plan versus the Virginia plan to really emphasize that. But then later books just start framing it as the Great Compromise. And the language of New Jersey kind of becomes buried in some of the other text and narratives that are being discussed in the whole as the debates are going on with the forming of the government. But it's interesting that it is one of those you would just, this was an important moment, and the inclusion or exclusion of materials goes back and forth depending on an edition that you look at, or even just trying to find that language within the materials. So in thinking of, and we can, open it up for discussion and conversation, or if anybody has questions for me, some key takeaways as I was going through these materials and looking at these, and just emphasizing again and understanding, and something that can be talked about to students, is that there is no static historical narrative. There are things that get included and excluded, and this changes over time. Things that were included at one point can get excluded later and then be re-included after that. So it's not even a matter of it gets excluded and we never see it again. It might come back later on. The space that's allocated to a topic. Now, as I explain a lot of times to students, we have to think about these books. These books are maybe, 500 pages, between 400 and 500 pages. Sorry about that. These are materials that, as time goes on, materials, more history needs to be included, and so we need to account for and exclude. We start to exclude things because we need to cram more into these books, because otherwise students would be walking around with an encyclopedia set on their back. And so we do have to understand that information is going to be sacrificed. We also have to understand that, there's an expansion of knowledge, new information and new understanding of something might come into play. And so we have to reevaluate how something is created. But, we are, when we look at these materials, we are assigning value and meaning to what we include and what we think is important. And that has a larger effect on, than we really think. And so, thinking in terms of, the study of textbook history, what I tend to do and what I tend to ask students to consider is, when they're looking at multiple books and comparing them, and even just looking at one text, I ask them to think about, what does it say? What does it mean? And why does it matter? And, we go through these different layers and thinking in terms of, what does it say? And that's kind of the language. And thinking, like I mentioned before, when we call, the American people as a country gained faith in Washington. So what does that mean? Assigning in 1776 the label of country, and having that conversation and mattering, and what does that matter, and what is that understanding of that time period? Not only even just thinking about in terms of the book as a time capsule, using a beacon in a dark time. What was going on in the 50s to make, that language be important to be included and frame things in that way. And also asking students, even before they open some of these materials, what are your expectations? What do you think you're going to see? What did you find surprising? And what are the larger contexts or influences in shaping that narrative? Is there a difference between a single historian writing a book versus a committee? Is there a difference between something that might be a state edition versus a larger edition? So having students really consider that information, what is being presented, beyond just, I'm reading this because when students tend to look at these materials, they think, and I've had students say it to me, that these are, as I mentioned, these are the authority. It's been written, so it has to be true, and sort of understanding those little subtleties, those little nuances, and then really thinking about what does it mean when we look at these broader texts and the influences that they have. And so, it's something that I find students take away a lot from when they see these, and you can see it just in these examples, these tiny these moments where we do see these subtle changes, and having that conversation. Well, what do you think if within 10 years, or 20 years, two different generations are learning something slightly different? And what impact does that have? And what discussions could that prompt? And so, students really get engaged when that happens. And, I think that it's a great opportunity to get them just thinking in general about, what it is they're reading or looking at, and then how do they interact with it rather than looking at it passively. So with that, and that's an image of the textbook collection. And so, like I said, we're getting materials all the time, and we're adding to the collection. But there, as I mentioned, a digital version. I did say to Rachel before we started that I am happy to answer questions, but also provide the presentation if anybody's interested in, working with the collection or study guides that I've created. I can definitely include those, and she can send them out to people that are here.